how you can communicate when you need to, but can't. So before we get into it, let me give you a little introduction about myself. I've been coming to DEF CON off and on since DEF CON 14. We won't talk about how old that makes me, please and thank you. I appreciate that. And I got to be real. Amateur radio is really the OG hacking hobby. I mean, it's the intent of it was freeing communication, and so I'm happy to hear talking about freeing communication with you, and I'll share a fun tidbit before we get too deep into things. The name ham, which is what we call ourselves, the ham comes from when the professional telegraph operators would refer to us amateurs as ham-fisted, and we said, you know what, screw you. We're going to take that term back. We're going to own it, because we're not about locking people away from communicating. That's not how we roll. That's not how we run. Ham radio has a long and rich history of being a communication tool and hobby, and a strong history sense of thumbing our collective noses at those folks that want to hold us back or silence us. So that's me. That's where I come from. I have to start with a disclaimer here. I can't stress it enough. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about here may not be allowed where you live. The rules for operations on amateur radio vary from location to location. So ultimately, whatever you do, whatever you take from this talk, in true DEF CON stance, it's on you. So if you use something I tell you and you break the rules, that's on you. That's not on me. I'm serious. It may not be permitted where you live. And if you come back to me later and say, hey, Nate, you talked to me about how to do blah, 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 whatever that is, my answer has to be, you need to contact your official licensing information for that guidance. I've had somebody from Japan come to me and say, hey, how do I do, encryption to satellite communications? And I'm like, I don't know the laws in Japan. Sorry. So I want to start off by going into the technology behind the revolution, if you will. Some of the things that really make us work, and I kind of don't want to just read off slides here, folks, but sometimes I got to. I got to get into the why things of here. Ham radio is decentralized by its nature, and if you understand the concepts of amateur radio, you can literally just go and build your own. Your design can be simple. I've seen people use it, what we call the spark gap transmitter, based off of a spark plug, and they're actually just generating sparks to transmit CW code. It is incredibly easy to build a transmitter, and it works everywhere. We have concepts like high frequency, which is actually longer in the wavelength, which lets you get your communications halfway around the planet on 4 or 5 watts of power. You can do tricks by bouncing your communications off of the ionosphere, maybe getting out of where you're at into a slightly more friendly location. And the advantage is that there's no central authority. And we're going to touch later on where there are governments that are seeking to censor the internet. And if you want to have uncensored communication, which is why we're here to talk about these things, you have to get around those government agencies that would want to censor it and prevent you from, 1, learning, and 2, sharing things, right? It's flexible. And everyone thinks, ham radio is just a bunch of guys talking on walkie-talkies that are stuck to their hip, and, one of them talks about how his gout hurts that day, and that's not how we roll. These days, modern ham radios have data interfaces. They've got Bluetooth. They've got packet modes. All of that function existed. So you can do digital messaging. You can build an IP data network. You can do all of those things because it's that flexible. All of those protocols, all those functions exist. And the interesting thing, and what I talk about, is the internet and ham radio go hand in hand. And so if anybody that's spent any serious time in the internet, you know that in the early days, large chunks of the internet, the /8s, were carved up and allocated to the various different groups. And so from an amateur radio standpoint, although we've given away the top end of the 44, we have a huge section of 44/8 that's still dedicated to amateur radio use because so many hams were involved in designing the IPv4 and then of course the modern internet and stuff like that. So you can do multiple modes. There is an incredibly low tech entry point. You can go incredibly long range. It's resilience. It works in disaster zones. And it is absolutely decentralized. Nobody controls you. There's no ISP, no government infrastructure, none of that stuff. You transmit, somebody receives, they reply. That's it. That's done. You bypass everything. And people are like, well, that's not how that actually works. And so I have case studies here. During World War II, a lot of communications were shut down. There was governments that were trying to prevent people from understanding what was happening in locations around the world. And in fact, during Hitler's reign, you couldn't even listen to the BBC. But you sure as hell could if you knew what you're doing and knew how to build a radio. So if you look in the background of this image, you'll actually see a radio that was hidden into the inside panel of a briefcase during World War II. The receiving and transmitting antenna was around the edges of the briefcase. And so the person would walk one side of the antenna, because all antennas are what we call a dipole. There's a positive side and a negative side. We'll attend go down to Can at Ham and learn more about this, by the way. The positive side was on one side, the negative side was on the other side, so now you have a dipole antenna that is your briefcase and the transmitter and the transceiver inside of it. The person would walk, set up, do their communications, close their briefcase, and look like any other business person walking on the train. The resistance used these clandestine radios to spread news, to organize. And even if you didn't transmit, sometimes being able to hear a message and just understand, hey, there's this group that I need to avoid, and they're checking train cars. So maybe I know that I need to get off the train. There was a group called Baum in Germany that would actually use radio to communicate, collaborate, and share information about Nazi atrocities during the war. They were the first groups that talked about how bad things were in the concentration camps. And the Allies would use what we call tin can receivers, which were really simple. They were transmitted via airdrops. They were about the size of 2 Altoid cans stacked together. You could drop them out of a plane at altitude with a little parachute. People can pick them up, and they could get information. And so sometimes just knowing where people were and what was going on was the difference for these individuals between life and death. But then people say, hey, Nate, World War II was a little while ago, dude. You want to come something more modern? We'll talk about the Soviet Union, who, of course, did all kinds of fun, interesting things with it. They would jam us. They would jam the Voice of America to try and get us. The Nazis actually tried tracking folks down with radios. They really did. They met with moderate success during the Cold War, the USSR dedicated a lot more efforts. And so that's where we learned a lot of our concepts like fox and hound in the ham radio thing about how to stay away from where you should be, where you shouldn't be. The USSR tried things like overpowering folks, so where they just throw a lot more power at the radio. They tried using what's called a woodpecker, and if you've ever driven by like a picket fence and seen all of those items that come together, and they look like basically a picket fence when you're doing it, it looks the exact same thing on your radio spectrum, and it's really hard to do that. But then there was a group called the Radio Hooligans, and that's what they called themselves. Don't ask me to say it in Russian. My Russian is so non-existent it's not even funny. But what they did is they were a bunch of underground radio operators, and they would go around, share the message of what needed to be said, what was happening, what was trying to be suppressed, which groups were being targeted, shall you say. And just being able to get that information to in some cases, intelligence operatives, let them safely exit the country. So we have a number of folks that are alive today because of ham radio. Really, really, really. Even more modern, Falklands War. This is one of my favorites. Everybody knows the Falklands are down off the coast of South America, and everyone knows that Scotland is not off the coast of South America, I hope. If not, geography, please. Geography. Les Hamilton, he's a ham radio guy. Because the Argentine government forgot that things bounce off the ionosphere, he was able to pick up their invasion plans of the Falkland Islands. And they went in there and they went high power, and they cut off all British resources to being able to defend the Falkland Islands. So this Scot, as he calls up the Home Office, hey, the Argentinians are invading. And at first they dismissed him. They really did. And he's like, no, you have to understand. Go call the base. Try and talk to these people. And it took them a couple of times, and Les, to his credit, did not give up. He's like, no, you have to understand. Your communication is cut off. And seriously, the guy is credited with helping the British government respond quicker to the invasion of the Falkland Islands. Now, whether you think that's right or wrong, there's that. But the Argentine government did absolutely disconnect all modern communications at the time. And it was ham radio that came in, and it was some random Scotsman with a giant antenna hanging off his roof that ended up being the lifeline communication. What supplies do we need? What are the humanitarian requirements? Who's injured? All of that stuff was what was relayed through this one guy because he was at the right spot with the right antenna at the right time. And I know. 1982 was not that long ago for me, but maybe for some of you it was a little bit longer. So let's talk about the Arab Spring. Radio is what we used to organize during the Arab Spring. It allowed people to safely organize. But we know that Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya shut down the internet. They shut down cell networks. They shut down everything. They employed stingray technology to try and capture who was doing the things. And ham radio people pulled up international news, and they were able to communicate with international journalists. This is what's happening on the front lines. These are what we're experiencing. And then, of course, even not that long ago, N8MOR was, 4 years ago when it happened? There was a military coup. And like every coup organization, they initially started trying to crack down on communication, because we can't let people communicate, because if they can communicate, they can organize. And if they can organize, they can resist. And if they can resist, then they're a threat to the power that be. So every time you see organizations try and thwart communications, every time you try and see folks trying to start censor stuff, and shout out to my EFF people around here, if you haven't talked to them, go talk to them. If you see people start trying to censor, there's things. But activists, they ranked up. They went to low-power ham radio. And when I say low-power ham radio, I mean low-power ham radio. This is a 1-watt transceiver. 1 watt. This will get you 50 or 60 miles if you use it right. And being able to send that signal and communicate matters, especially if you pair it with directional antennas. And I'll touch more on directional antennas and why they matter. But a directional antenna allows you to narrow and focus in that beam or that signal to make it, 1, harder to track, but also 2, much more effective when it gets there. And of course, all these pieces feed into what we call OPSEC. And OPSEC matters, yo. If you're out there and you're at one of the protests, or you're trying to get news on where the government doesn't want you getting news from, or you're trying to share information about what your government is or is not doing, you are considered hostile to them. And so you have to practice operational security. Triangulation is a real risk for people that do the stuff like this. It really is. We can talk about it, but if you have 3 people listening in on a signal, you can find out where that person is in 3-dimensional space. It does not take much. So since we got some of these historical use cases, let's get into why it matters. And when I say avoid fixed locations, that's what I mean. The longer you're in any one spot, the easier it is for someone to locate you. So don't stay put. Move. A mobile setup, even walking with a little handheld unit, is exponentially more difficult to locate than a stationary operator. You can also do things like cut down power. So there is no sense in running this guy at 250 watts, something like that. There's no sense in running a giant transmitter or that 100-watt unit there at the back in the loop. You don't have to run a giant transmitter to get your signal out. Small, quiet. So in ham radio speak, we call that QRP. So you go quiet, you lower your power. And it's the difference between a whispered conversation and shouting with a megaphone. So when you bring your volume or your transmit power down, you make your receiving person have to work harder to hear you, but you also make it that much more difficult. I like digital modes. I make no beefs about that. So digital modes are another way to do it. Digital modes like JS8 or PSK31 or whatever, that actually lets you send information encoded in audio. And when you can encode that message in audio, it makes it harder for somebody to do anything with it. I don't know anybody heard that. If you did, I hope that it got through. But that was a message. That was encoded audio. And to a non-trained ear, it just sounds like static. That message, by the way, said, "Hello, DEF CON. Welcome to DC 33. I'm November 8, Mike Oscar Romeo, and I'm thrilled you're here." So that short little message contained actually a couple of sentences, right? Really short. But by using these digital modes, you make it that much more difficult for a surveillance organization to understand. You can embed all kinds of information in those digital modes. You can use, and I touched on it just a second ago, but you can use what's called directional antennas. And shout out to somebody that wants to be known by their hacker handle. So Gaspod T Wonderdog. You can find him on GitHub. He has this. This is a directional antenna Moxon generated device. So you put in the specific frequency that you want. He published it in GitHub. You download it. I'll have links to it in my slides as well. If I point it like this, and you can see in the picture here just how directional that signal is. So this little guy with a 2-watt transmitter, I was able to reach from my home in the San Francisco area down to San Jose. And I'd gone and had folks with what we call software-defined radios, where they're just listening to everything. So people trying who knew where I was, knew what I was doing, knew what I was saying, and actively seeking to find me, could not pick up this signal because it was that directional. And this is set for 446 megahertz because that's where I like to fox hunt. But you know, that's the point here. Directional antennas make it harder for someone to get in the middle of your signal, and that's the game here, right? So you have to be able to prevent your adversary, your hostile government, from getting in the middle of what you're trying to do, but still communicate with that far end node, all right? And then you can use things like disguised equipment to make it harder to see. Right here is one of my favorite things. Everybody looks at it and they're like, that looks like a lunchbox strung up a tree, and you'd be absolutely right. It's a construction lunchbox strung up a tree. It really is. It's inside it. It's got 2 little radios and a little Raspberry Pi that records what is coming in on one radio, waits a predefined amount of time, and then rebroadcasts it out. So if I get on my radio and I say, "Hey, watch out, ICE is over there," hypothetically speaking, of course, hypothetically speaking. And then a second or two later, that same message is repeated from up a tree at a different thing. It sounds exactly like me, the whole 9 yards. Well, now I've introduced confusion. Well, is he over here or is he over there? Well, he could be in either location. And you can configure variables in there and have that message go or do different things. You can have predefined messages. And as long as you're adhering to the rules of your operating license, i.e. you're identifying yourself, your call sign's embedded in these things, you're clear. There's nothing they can do about it. You didn't break any of the rules, but you did make it very hard for them to figure out where the hell you're at and what you're up to. You can hide things in everyday objects. For funsies, when I take my car to go be dealt with by the dealership, I'll hide a ham radio transmitter in there to see if they're taking my Jeep for a joyride. You would be surprised at the number of technicians that really like taking people's cars for a joyride. So it's kind of fun to see what they're going and where they're doing. And you can disguise your stuff. How many people noticed the long wire antenna on the floor? None of you did. It's been here, and so, well, it looks like a string to you. Huh? Maybe I treat it as a clothesline. I've got my laundry drying. That doesn't mean it's not a functional antenna. But someone's coming around looking for somebody on the radio and transmitting about, what's happening in negative locations. They're not going to notice clotheslines and clothes drying. That's not what they're looking for. And I'll move that before it becomes a tripping hazard. I'll move it before it gets a tripping hazard. And a lot of the questions I get after that one, okay, well then, what does a good stealth setup look like? So small, mobile, battery powered. But imagine you're at a protest, hypothetically speaking, of course, right? And you're trying to keep communication lines open just long enough to know what's going on. I got a handheld underneath my shirt. How many people would notice if you had earbuds in? Nobody. So they use the modern radios, use Bluetooth, sitting like this. You're not even seeing the radio. You just see a guy that has earbuds in, and it looks normal. You got your protest sign, which has a little push-to-talk button sitting on your thumb. You hit that button, and you can say whatever you need to say, or you can even just retransmit what's being said around you. But more importantly, it has to meet the needs of your communications, right? A lot of times in a digital day, we need to digitally communicate. So I need to get pictures out of what is happening. I need to get that off to the international press, or I need to send emails up. So VHF, UHF for local communications, HF for long distance. It does not need to be big at all. This radio I'm holding up in my hand covers about 42% of the planet with an antenna. And I can communicate. It bounces off the ionosphere. No one intercepts it. No one can prevent it. They can listen, and that gets into the whole operational security. We're going to talk about that. But they can't stop it. But that black wire, no one would notice it. And then you look for dual purpose things. My favorite thing is actually you can have a very good antenna sitting in a beach umbrella. It works. And if you're in a remote location, let these things happen for you. Let them plan for you. Remote location, you're sending reports. A compact multiband radio can get communications literally thousands of miles, sometimes 10,000 miles, and into safer geographic regions. And if you look in the background of this old school Ford Bronco, who notices the canoe antenna? The canoe is the antenna. No one is going to think that your canoe is what you're using to transmit. They're not even going to look, right? But an aluminum canoe, it's metal. It'll tune. Send the signal, for crying out loud. Actually, that one is tuned specifically for 10 meters, by the way. And I have to start again here. Encrypted communications on amateur radio is not permitted in most locations. The rule in the FCC is you cannot obfuscate the intent of your message, but you can do things like encrypt connections to satellites as long as you're very clear about what you're trying to do there. So there are times when you can use encryption, but you don't have to, right? So you can have code words, right? Again, it's obfuscating, but It's right on that line. We're gonna go way beyond that line, anyways. You can also do things like spread the signal out. Spread spectrum. FHSS is interesting. Frequency hopping spread spectrum is fun because it bounces from location to location. So without breaking any of the rules, the first chunk of my message is on one frequency on one band. The next section is somewhere else. The next section is somewhere else, and so on and so forth. There's actually a Linux plugin. It's in Raspbian if you have Raspberry Pi that actually does it all for you. It issues what we call cat commands to the radio and sends the next section. And so an adversary then has to also know where and when you're shifting and why you're shifting and what you're shifting to. So if the first chunk of the message is in JS8 and the second chunk of the message is on a different band in PSK31 and the third chunk of the message is sent over RTTY, like that's an impossible thing for an adversary to deal with. You cannot track and respond to those things often enough to make useful intelligence as a listening agency. But as an activist, you've already got that all planned out, and everybody else is already receiving it. They've got it. They've recombined the message. They've got it figured out, and they're acting upon the message, and then you pack up and leave. You paddle your canoe to the other side of the lake. And yes, technically, code words break the obfuscation rules. But a properly worded structure makes that incredibly difficult to prove, as evidenced by all the historical actions we've touched on in the beginning. Obscure modems like PSK31, which is fun to use, or RTTY, which is if you ever heard the beep, 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 not the background for the the BBC, the budding news sound, not the CW as we call it, or a lot of people know as Morse code. Stuff like that, the obscure stuff, people don't think of. All they hear is, well, that's just noise. Someone's just sending the buzzer if you're listening to Russian stuff. And then, of course, because we can stand up an IP network or a data network, we can use things like GNU-PG. And we can use tools like PAT, which sends email in a web browser in a peer-to-peer mode. So I send it, it's encoded, because again, we're not encrypting, we're encoding in GNU-PG. That's an option. You can give really secure communications in a public medium while still playing by the letter of the law. And as long as you publish, hypothetically, whatever you're doing on, put on GitHub or whatever, here's the decoding key for this funny stuff I'm doing, and make it only valid for 24 hours, you've played by the letter of the law. But I can guarantee you the U.S. federal government doesn't have enough people to scrape all of GitHub in a day. And of course, where it's going. Ham radio is going to be featured in Digital Resistance. It has to be. My favorite thing to run and to demonstrate, especially when I'm talking to kids, is satellite-based ham radio, or talking to the astronauts on the International Space Station. They love that stuff. Or using the moon to send signals to the other side of the planet, right? So Earth, Moon, Earth bounce. So satellite-based ham radio, whether it's a man-made satellite or a natural satellite, are things you can do, and there's no internet required to make that happen. You can use mesh networks. Shout out to the Arden folks running a mesh network over RF from one side of the room to the other, right? And mesh networks or HF radio, you can do off-grid communications without any of those things. So, we can use hack together consumer-grade stuff for the Arden network, and it's a self-assembling network. So you don't have to actually do anything. You put your firmware on there, you configure it, you stand it up, and it will build that data network for you. And then now we just have an IPv4 network. And what can you run on top of IPv4? Everything. We're going to also start seeing even more advances in what we call weak signal processing. JS8, FT8, stuff like that, FT4. If you don't know what those terms are, we can talk about them later. But they are actually developed by a NASA engineer to communicate with satellites in deep space. So they're incredibly resilient. They share that message. And then we've got folks like DeepSig and Radio ML that are actually using machine learning and artificial intelligence to figure out better ways to get more data in a more redundant fashion. And I know, we're all here like, nothing I've talked about here is going to prevent a motivated adversary from finding you and finding out what you're trying to talk about, right? And we can sit here and talk all day long about all of the things we can do to make it harder to find me, make it harder to find out what I'm talking about, all of that stuff. We can talk about those things. But ultimately, if they ever find you, there's, the XKCD crypto nerd question. I'm not putting it up for copyright. But the crypto nerd, they think, oh, it's we can't read it because it's AES 256 encrypted. And then they say, well, yeah, just go hit him with this wrench until he gives us the password. That's a very real thing. But that's where the staying mobile, that's where staying mobile actually matters. That's make them harder for them to find you, right? So yeah, don't get hit with a hammer. And I want everybody in this room to actually think about this and how you can get involved and how you can help. And I know that it can feel overwhelming. Some of the things you can do are simple. Get your license. We're running tests for free, literally right next door. Keep your identity safer. You can do things like register for a mailbox before you give the U.S. federal government your call sign, assuming you're in the U.S. It keeps your primary residence. I don't know that it necessarily matters a ton, but some people like that. You can mentor, and I know people are like, well, I'm new. I haven't done anything. How can I mentor? Just talking about this stuff, talking about how you can do these things and how you can enable other people to do these things. Even if you think you don't know something, trust me, you wouldn't be in this room if you didn't know something, and you wouldn't be sitting here listening to me talk if you didn't have the ability to talk and mentor yourself. But most importantly, hack this shit. Like seriously, all the stuff we talk about, all of this equipment we have here that looks fancy and commercial and put together, it was designed by hackers because fuck you, government. Seriously, that's where it came from. They were trying to hold us back, and we touched on the beginning. The professionals didn't want us to do it. That's why we're ham, because we were ham-fisted. We just pushed that shit through. Engage with your local community. I know it's sometimes a little bit scary to reach out and put yourself out there and stuff like that, but do engage with your local community because it is the local community that needs the help the most. And of course, visit us at our Discord and join this merry band of misfits, because all of these folks here in the Ham Radio Village are fantastic people, and I love them. So, and I know it's cheesy, but you can't kill the airwaves, and I think it's more important today than ever to have open communications and be able to speak freely in a free society. And oppressive locations, oppressive regimes might jam frequencies. They might shut down the internet. They might turn off cell phone access. They can't kill radio. As long as you keep transmitting, receiving, the truth is always going to find a way to get through. And for those that are in free countries, it's up to you to keep those skills alive. Learn the technology. It's not hard. Everybody here in, it looks like yellow shirts in the Ham Radio Village will happily talk to you about the technology required to make it happen. Build the gear. It isn't hard. Basic soldering. We have soldering stations down in the Can It Ham contest. You can build an antenna. Teach. Share what you know. And because you never know when you might be in a situation when the airwaves are your last means of communication. I close it out with the cheesy line. The revolution might not be tweeted, but it will be transmitted. And I thought I'd actually leave a couple minutes here at the end Opening up round questions. Disclaimer, I can't encourage illegal operations. If you want to talk about that, talk to me later. So if you're asking me how you're going to run AES 256 over ham radio, I can't answer that in public. Laws vary from place to place. In some places it's legal, and I can't do it. But any questions about anything I've talked about here, y'all? Okay, so great question. I don't know if everybody heard it. The question was, since we can run Arden, which sets up an IPv4 network, and once we have an IPv4 network, we can run HTTPS traffic across it. How do we deal with that in the encrypted world? And I'm going to give you the technical book answer, and then I'm going to give you the real answer. The technical book answer is you just run HTTP, and you tag each packet with your call sign and the whole 9 yards. And the practical answer is nobody cares, nobody looks, it happens too fast. Anything else? I'm sorry, could I go back across the bail box? Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Thank you. So the question was, okay, if you sign up for a mailbox, how do you use a mailbox or a P.O. box to safeguard your identity? So one of the things, and a little bit of background, that was a fantastic question. When you become a ham radio license operator, the address you use to register as a ham becomes part of the public record. It does. The FCC only emails you these days anymore. It's all done over email, but that's a leftover from that. You have to have an address where you can receive snail mail. And because it's a matter of public record, if somebody wanted to harass you, they could look up your address and go look at you, right? My opinion is if my operational security depends on somebody going to a P.O. box and being thwarted, I have failed at OPSEC. I don't bother personally, and my call sign's everywhere, so there's that. But a lot of people get a lot of comfort in it, and it does cut down a little bit on the stalkers. So the purpose of that is you go sign up for mailboxes, et cetera, P.O. box, whatever, and then just go get your mail whenever it shows up. So the requirement from the FCC, letter of the law, is a place you can receive mail. So I know people use work addresses. I know people use mailbox services. All of those options exist. You can send it to your parents' house. General delivery is another great example. Thank you. And that gets you the compliance with the law without actually giving out your real identity. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anybody else want to play Stump the Chump? You guys have been fantastic. My name is Nate, call sign November 8, Mike Oscar Romeo. Thank you.